society. So today's presentations will be done by a few people. Two of them are sitting here, two of them online. So one of the presenters will be Aizharkyn, Director of the Civil Society Initiative at UCA, and Nargis Kuchakshoeva. She is also from Civil Society Initiative of UCA, but based in Dushanbe. Then we have one presenter from practitioner side, Efremova. She represents Smart Zharan Foundation, which works on developing capacity of civil society and monitoring civic space, and myself. So there's four presenters who will present. So I'll ask each presenter to confine at most to 10 minutes. And unless there will be urgent immediate comments, we will maybe postpone questions and comments after we'll hear all presentations, if you don't mind. But if you have something urgent, you can ask questions immediately after presentation. Okay? So with that, let's start, because the title of our session is that Development of Civil Society in Kyrgyzstan, but we also have presentation from Tajikistan. And let's create experts thinking atmosphere here for us to discuss how we can answer this question. And we'll start with a presentation by Aizharkyn. Aizharkyn, please, floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you very much, Medet. Good morning, still good morning to everyone. So let me share my screen. Medet, just to clarify once again, 10 minutes, yeah?
Yes, 10 minutes, please.
Okay. So my presentation, which is entitled Navigating Complexity, Understanding Challenges and Trends in Kyrgyzstan Civil Society, is based on a research which has been conducted in two phases, just a few months after the COVID pandemic started in 2020. And then the second phase happened in this spring 2023. The key idea was actually to trace history of development of non-governmental sector in Kyrgyzstan after independence of the republic, and then to identify which lessons learned from the past and challenges and development trends can be considered in order to understand the future development of NGOs in our country. I need to say that basically this research has some limitations because in COVID period, the most interviews, and this was a key method used, was all the interviews were conducted in online format due to this lockdown conditions and so. And then another point which should be given here is that, of course, this perception of NGO sector is based on the opinion of NGO members and experts and those who actually work actively with civil society organizations. And in this sense, in my case, in this research, I didn't deal with a large scale of audience in order to consider how, for example, in general, the whole population consider non-governmental sector. So here's very briefly, you could see that the history of civil society is divided into 4 stages, and usually in literature it was identified in 3 stages between 1991, 94, then 95, 2004, then 2005 and 2020. But then based on the interviews with women-led organizations and leaders of non-governmental organizations, so here we could identify the 4th stage for NGO sector started from 2020. And this stage is characterized by a lot of concerns about security of civil activists and those who are actively trying to promote human rights, democratic principles, liberal values, and so. And then a huge feeling of burning out or a kind of moral fatigue, which a lot of leaders who have been working for 30 years already feel at the moment. And this moral fatigue is connected, first of all, with understanding that most of the efforts or achievements are now not just subjected to a risk of reduction or elimination, but in general, a lot of things can be just lost at all. So here you could see the table, which actually shows all the legislation changes related to civil society organizations, starting from 1996, and then you're all aware of these attempts to impose a new law on non-commercial organizations in Kyrgyzstan. So here is the type of organizations which we have in our country. I will not pay too much attention to this typology. And then let me just quickly jump to how civil society is given in literature. I will not give too much attention to this aspect because my colleague Nargis would cover, speaking about Tajikistan, and then probably Medet will also speak about it, considering our republic. So just a few things which I think need to be pointed out here, that we still have quite a lot reference to the Soviet Union or to the concept of the post-Soviet, despite the fact that we've been living without this kind of Soviet reality for 30 years, but we still have this reference to the post-Soviet or Soviet legacy. And then there was a huge concept of social norms, which were considered as an obstacle for democratic development. But now, in a lot of interviews, it's more and more ideas reflecting that social norms should be considered not as an obstacle, but actually as a background which we cannot ignore, working with the population and trying to jump in with some interventions in order to achieve a kind of social development or make any changes in social, political, and cultural environment. And here you could also see that the concept of religious radicalization is quite often used, not only in literature, but in interview with women-led organizations, for example. Also, this concept has been oftenly mentioned, saying that this is one of the key challenges which civil society organizations have now in order to deal with broad masses of people. And then another concept or the problem which is also actively, let's say, considered by organizations is social polarization. And here even more, let's say, maybe strong term is social dispersion, where it's more and more difficult to reach a sort of compromise, a consensus between different social groups in order to find some common values which could somehow integrate people or to make them feel closer. So in terms of challenges, we can group challenges for civil society organizations. We can divide them into four groups. This is political environment, economic environment, social environment, and technological issues. I will just briefly give some examples related to each of these sections. Speaking about political environment, of course, now this very I would say, in some sense, dramatic process of demonization of NGOs, a lot of hate speech and aggression towards civil society organizations, which is in some sense orchestrated by political authorities and in many senses supported by broad population. Of course, it creates a lot of problems for the activities of this of civil society actors. And then, of course, this new law, which is going through parliamentary discussions, is going to very largely reduce the activities of NCOs in Kyrgyzstan. And then a lot of opinions reflect the problem of low representation of women in the governmental sector and at the sector of decision-making. And in this sense, of course, it relates in some sense to increasing religious and traditional agenda on the one hand, and on the other hand, it's also the question of the quality of preparation of women leaders to become decision makers and to be influencers which are able to promote some new ideas and to bring some new ideas. Then speaking about the problem of communication with the governmental institutions. A few years ago, in 2020, for example, in my interviews, the key problem which was reflected by interviewees was that lack of interaction with civil society sector. Now, for example, the more and more opinions are about complete ignore of civil society sector in decision-making process. And of course, in this sense, this distrust of NGOs towards the state is increasing on and on. And at the same time, it leads to a kind of alienation of civil society organization from the decision-making process, which makes them very much concerned about the future of not the only institutional organizational activities, but in general, speaking about the political environment in Kyrgyzstan. In terms of economy, here one of the key problems is dependence of non-governmental sector on external funding. And of course, this still at work. And but there are some positive tendencies which I will reflect a little bit later. And then what else can be added here, speaking about social context? I would point just a few things. First of all is the safety and security issues. And this safety and security issues is not just about institutional structure of organizations, but it's more about personal lives of leaders who are trying to promote liberal values and speak about democracy, which in many senses turned to discourse promoted by authorities that all these trends or ideas which are given by NGO sector is just to undermine, let's say, traditional cultural contexts. And in this sense, this is a huge stigmatization of NGOs as foreign agencies and those who are promoting values which are very far from the context and should be simply eliminated from any type of interventions. And in this sense, the problem, which is also reflected in interviews, that it's not just about NGOs which are funded from Western international organizations or donors, but the problem is that this is, first of all, a kind of search for internal enemy, which will anyway lead to accumulation of protest potential in society, and this is one of the problem. Another problem is that and this is a sort of contradiction which is also reflected by interviewees, that the protest mass now is declining because a lot of leaders feel completely burnout. And in terms of technological environment, here there are still quite a lot of problems related to cybersecurity and social media bullying, which NGO organizations have to face, unfortunately, on a daily basis. And at the same time, the problems to reach, let's say, rural areas and wider population through technological mechanisms. But among some new challenges here, what should be mentioned is generation gap between experienced organizations and young organizations, aging of experts, a kind of inertia of partnership between international donors and local organizations who are included into pool of, let's say, reliable NGOs, which the donors prefer to collaborate with. And then, of course, this new law and which may force a lot of organizations to work in a very limited scale with no possibility to cooperate and create huge platforms. But at the same time, there are some positive trends, and this the last point which I would like to bring to your attention is that some NGOs which now feel that this generational gap should be somehow filled in, they are trying to create coaching programs in order to deliver and transmit their experience to young organizations or to young leaders. Then this is building new platforms which are going to become more practical in terms of projects and various activities to be implemented. And then many organizations are now trying to establish their own joint funds in order to support each other and not rely upon to external aid and external financial support. So these things can be considered as a sort of positive trends despite a very hostile environment where civil society have to operate at the moment. That's it. Medet, sorry, I guess I have exceeded my time given.
Thank you, Aizharkyn, for your presentation. And if there are unless urgent questions, we can proceed to the second presenter, who will talk about the systematic literature review on civil society in Tajikistan. Nargis, 10 minutes.
Hello, dear colleagues, dear attendees and speakers. It's a great honor to present our systematic literature review on civil society of Tajikistan. Let me share my screen. It's visible, right? Okay.
You can enlarge it, make it full screen if possible.
Yeah. All right. Okay. This systematic literature review has been conducted earlier this year. The findings of this literature review will be discussed immediately. I can't go in depth into the methodological guidance which it was followed. There was a specific methodological guidance that this literature review was followed, but we shall skip it for the findings. The goal of this literature review was to identify previous studies on civil society in Tajikistan and research diverse forms of self-organization in the associational life of Tajik community, and of course to research and evaluate the roles and practices of civil society actors, such as civil society organization, non-profit organization, those who are actively engaged in resolving local issues at the community and national levels. So based on the findings and after thorough analysis of the research materials, it was found that civil society is an ambiguous term, and it has a different meaning based on how it was developed throughout decades and how it was shaped. And in Tajikistan, it was found that civil society organizations consist of formal and informal organizations, and the traditional institutions, or other words, grassroots organizations, have found the most influential among all newly formed civil society organizations, and those typically mahalla, jamaat, or awlad. It means kinship. So these are the most influential. However, based on the recent findings on COVID-19, volunteers, women-led organizations, and digital civil society organizations has made a significant contributions towards well-being of community, especially through service delivery and fundraising activities. So we have among them mass media, digital civil society, internet activities, those internet activists, and independent journalists as well, and youth, especially volunteers and women-led organizations. And then we have business associations, which are considered civil society organizations, charity organizations, faith-based organizations, human rights, and professional associations. So it was found that throughout, like between 1991 and 2020, there was a significant growth in the number of civil society organizations. It's actually right after the independence of the country in Tajikistan. After 1991, the civil society organization has peaked up from 300 in number to over 2,500 by 2020. And among them, based on the sources from the Erkina, which conducted a large-scale research, empirical research into the civil society organization development in Tajikistan, it was found that women-led organizations were particularly at the peak with its growth, because around 20%, more than 20% of the whole civil society sector was led by the women-led organizations, and then it followed by the growth in the civil society organizations dedicated to education, science, and culture, was around like 20%. Yes, and it's a women-led organization, actually was 28, more than 28%. Then 20% was the education and science culture organizations in the civil society sector. And the least number of the civil society organizations which were dedicated to human rights were around 500%. And then we had professional associations and youth and children organizations among them, humanitarian and charity organizations. As we can see, the largest number were women-led organizations at that time. But these are just, it's important to know that these are outdated numbers, but there is a critical need for such in-depth research to be conducted in nearest future to get up-to-date data on the number of civil society organizations in Tajikistan. And the key findings of this research, the Erkina research into the development of civil society, was that Tajikistan at that time made a significant contribution to state building process while actively participating, like the civil society participation in social service delivery, including the delivery of humanitarian aid and increasing political accountability So it's interesting to get a new look, to repeat kind of research, to take a look at the new data. Okay. Okay, and I would like to highlight the financial status of the civil society organizations based on the systematic literature review. It was found that civil society organizations are very dependent on external funding, especially the key international organizations that are assisting civil society organizations financially are AKF, USAID, UN organizations, and World Bank. And it's important to note that these organizations are also, like donors and international organizations, are also assisting civil society organizations in Tajikistan with capacity building trainings and project development at community level. And that's why many researchers think that the partnership between civil society organizations and donors are more advanced and compared to the partnership between the state and the civil society organizations. And the recent research study demonstrated that civil society organizations are like practicing democratization at the grassroots level, even though the space of the civil society, of the practices of civil society organizations are shrinking lately. The grassroots organizations are still keeping the spirit of civil society alive in the country, and they are actively contributing to the civil society development in the country. And as said, traditional institutions are actively involved in key projects focused on improving the quality of life and empowering people. And they receive capacity building training regularly, and from the international organizations and donors, and they are trusted for their abilities to solve conflicts and to support a local community at a time of crisis. And that's why they are valued more among donors as well. So there are certain problems which are limiting the civil society organizations' activities in the country, and most of all is the lack of financial sustainability of the civil society organizations. They are largely dependent on, heavily dependent on the external fund. And there are certain situations when the external funds end, many civil society organizations also quit operating. And of course, the next problem is associated with the limitation of awareness about civil society organizations' activities, especially among state authorities. And there are certain situations that when this problem is at the peak, there are distrust between. It causes distrust between civil society organization and the state government, and it is limiting the practices of civil society organizations as well. So the next problem is associated with the corruption. Corruption in the country is largely spread, and it is also seen in the sector of civil society, and sometimes it also challenges the civil society organizations to engage in advocacy practices against corruption. It challenges them to advocate policies as well. So the next challenge is unstable rule of law. It was seen that over the years, the legislation on civil society has indeed changed periodically, which restricted to the activities of civil society as well, especially those legislations which are related to the financial status of civil society or to the taxation. The high tax pay civil society organizations has to pay a high tax to to the state, so to operate in the country, and this is one of the greatest challenges for them. And the next is the lack of training and capacity building. Even though they receive, civil society organizations receive trainings and capacity building, sometimes those organizations which are mostly inhabited the remote regions, they don't receive it, and many of them they are left without without trainings and capacity building. So there is an issue of with having the relevant skills and knowledge for the 21st century, so they can implement it in their activities regularly. And the next problem is associated with the access of civil society to diverse sources of information. It's also mostly related to those which are which are living in the remote areas of the country, and they have, but in general, there is a lack of communication between, within the civil society as well as with this wider community of the civil society abroad. Okay, and while analyzing the materials and selecting the relevant sources for the literature review, it was found that there is a significant limitation in the findings. in the literature sources over the 30 year of the 30 years. It was like when we did during the methodological part, we researched the material over the 30 years, and we just identified only one large-scale empirical research conducted by the EKD in 2007, and there were other research, the primary sources, but they were mostly they had mostly comparative nature, and were limited in methodology and in samples as well, and they couldn't cover the whole region of Tajikistan. Therefore, it's significantly needed to recommend for the future investigation, for the future empirical research, to look into the civil society development and its further practices in the country, and also to take a look at the government partnership of the government and civil society organizations, and very important to look at the women's role and youth role as well in the civil society actors sectors, and their participations and engagements at all levels, especially at national level, in the sectors of economic and political sectors as well, and their engagement in decision making. So there's very important recommendation from other sources as well, like how to look specifically into the the faith-based institutions and the volunteers, their roles, the roles of volunteers in the civil society sectors. And of course, the roles of civil society in addressing countries' priority issues, especially those issues which are considered national development, which are part of national development goals of the country, such as social equity, improved education, healthcare, climate change response, and employment development. So these are the main findings and recommendations of this systematic review. So if you have any questions, please, I'm open to any questions. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. And again, there are no urgent immediate questions. We'll proceed to the next two presentations in order to have some time for us for general questions and comments and discussion. The next presentation. Можно запустить, пожалуйста? Презентацию можно запустить? And I'll be rather short in order to give more time for our first presenter, who will be speaking about the shrinking civic space, something which I think we all concerned and worried about. And my presentation will be, even though, sorry, I made it in Russian, I'll present in English, but it will be few texts and few slides with graphs. And the general, a bit ambitious attempt was trying to understand what are the citizens' attitudes towards what we can understand as citizenship and civil society. And it's just to warn you, it's a research at the stage of starting phase, and it's some preliminary maybe glimpses on some data which I was trying to look at in different surveys, and it's more like hypothesis generation in this regard, because the general question is that we know that things are not so good, but then can we understand why they're not so good in terms of society's attitudes? Something which also was referred to in the prior two presentations, and the Swedish slide, because one of the issues, of course, in Kyrgyzstan, what we notice, we have a quite populistic regime, and we see that across many other countries, not only in this country, in this region. And of course, that happens not just because politicians decide to take this kind of course of political strategy, but they feel that they can create some symbiosis with society, and they sense that there is a rising demand for certain conservative attitude by a society of politicians. And this rise of conservatism, something which, of course, been notable not for one decade, even longer in this country particularly. And then, of course, the question is that how it goes along with development of civil society and attitudes of people towards something which they understand as citizenship and civil society. And of course, there have been different studies about what citizenship means, and there have been some surveys, but unfortunately, there were no systematic surveys over time. And my idea was trying to understand what is dynamics over time, because of course, we can take any surveys and see what happens in certain state of time in certain given year or certain period of time and see cross-section why certain things look the way they look. But the idea was trying to look at certain changes over time. So moving further, I was mostly trying to look and still looking at the World Values Survey, which focuses on many questions which may relate to something which I'm interested in terms of attitudes to what it means to be a citizen and the attitudes to civil society. And of course, there is not so much, well, there are some direct questions in that survey, which then can be put together in terms of trying to index of general understanding of citizens, how do they feel themselves as citizens in terms of their attitudes. And despite quite a number of decades of the survey worldwide, but in Kyrgyzstan, it covers only 3 waves out of 7 waves by now. It's 2003, 2011, and 2020. Right before the COVID started, the survey was finished in Kyrgyzstan in its last wave. And so I was using some of it. Next slide, please. And it's a scattered glimpse in certain questions, which may give us maybe a certain idea, if not an idea, but at least questions further, how to look for certain sense of perception of being a citizen. And some of the questions is that been asked in the survey, which are interesting from my perspective, I think, was that questions about certain traits you would like to see in your children, to which they should grow with. And some of these questions, which I just randomly selected. No, it's as you see here, the blue bars, and it's a percentage of answers where they put these traits as a top 5, for example. In the children, it's blue, it's at 2011, and orange, it's at 2020 answers. And these 5 traits goes like independence in children, the sense of responsibility, tolerance, the third one, and respect to others, being unselfish, and being obedient. And of course, it's yet difficult, as they said, it's preliminary to get a sense what happens in terms of dynamics. And it's just, again, to say about the limitation, what I'm presenting, it's also good. That's what I'm doing in the process now to include 2003 as well, to see sort of dynamics. But of course, there are certain changes in terms of sense of independence, which quite drastically drops, but also in terms of being obedient also drops. There are some other traits which can be thought of how to raise a good citizen in your family by trying to develop certain specific traits in your children. I think that's may tell us something about. Next, please. One of the questions which was also asked about attitudes toward religion. And then not only to religion in terms of doing yourself faithful and religious, but also attitudes toward others. And that also speaks to the such citizenship qualities as being tolerant. And one of the questions which was asked is that the only acceptable religion is my religion. Do you agree with that? And I, of course, different answers, but I just chosen to pick specific answers. Blue section of these bars, it's absolutely agree with that, and then rather agree with that. So it's a positive answer to this question. Do you agree that the only acceptable religion is your religion? And you see the trends between 2011 and 2020. In a row, of course, the proportion goes up. But as you see, the blue bar proportion in 2020 goes up. It means that those who definitely and absolutely agree with that also quite quickly goes up, which I think also one of the trends we can think and explore further. There's also questions related to attitudes and relationship with the state in regard, for example, privacy. Would you agree that states, for example, organize video surveillance in public places? That's the left bar. Would you agree that the government would monitor your electronic emails as well to monitor internet? It's his middle bar. And then would you agree the government will collect information about you without you being knowing that? It's a right bar. And then the answers goes from bottom to up. It's absolutely yes, perhaps not. And then Euro section, it's absolutely not. And it's just for 2020, it's just recent trend. As you see, there is a certain mix. In one sense, there is no, people don't mind if the government does this kind of things. But of course, when it comes to specific issues, directly people ask if they will collect information about them. They tend to be a bit more reluctant to give government such right. And then, on the next graph, you see a comparison between 2011 and 2020, just on one question related to surveillance of your email and internet. And you see from the left to the right, absolutely yes, perhaps not, and then on the right, absolutely not. And as you see that absolutely yes, it goes quickly up, but also absolutely not slightly goes up. So I think that also speaks to some trends, which I'll come back to in my conclusion. Slide. And the next couple of slides, well, maybe, sorry, it's not yet visible. It's a participation in public organizations. It covers 3 ways, 2003, 11, and 2020. And people were asked, do you participate actively or non-actively in different types of organizations? And just to make a long story short, not to look at this complicated graph, is that there is a slight increase over time, but the peak, of course, goes for 2011. But of course, we should take into account that the survey was taken just a year after these dramatic events of 2010, interesting conflict, revolution, and so forth. And that could be maybe an explanation why it happens. Next slide, please. The same information, but for 2020, it's just different types of organizations where people take part actively or non-actively. Active is the blue section. Sorry, non-active blue section, and active is orange section. But it happens to be that people now actively participate in types of organizations such as religious organizations, sports organizations, trade unions, and so forth, and not so much about like, for example, women's groups, environmental organizations, consumer associations, and so forth, which also speaks about the tendency of people to take part, if they do take part, because at most it goes up to 14% of people who answered for certain types of organizations they take part in. And the last graph in my slides is that people take part and participate in what's called political activism and social activism. And again, just for you to note, it's for 2020. And it goes again from the left to the right. I'll just show you that, for example, people tend to participate less in petition, boycotting, participating in peaceful demonstrations, and more keen to work on such activities like social activism related activities, like, for example, donating certain groups or campaigns. in terms of political activism, trying to contact governmental official goes on the top. It's two biggest bars. The right bar is contacting officials. And these are just, again, answers of those who said, yes, they've done this. It's a blue section of these bars. And orange section of the bar, if you would like to, would you participate? And they said, perhaps yes. But of course, I didn't show the other part of the story when they said, well, it's not acceptable, because that's quite often also the other side of this coin, saying that people quite often tend to negatively view, for example, boycotting, taking part in strikes, or going for peaceful demonstration and so forth. And the last slide, I'm finishing, is preliminary conclusions, which I think will guide further how to work on this data analysis and looking at different surveys. Is that, of course, there is a rise of conservatism. Generally, I think that's more or less visible and seen. Of course, it should be tested and verified by looking at different other data. There is a growing tendency and demand for authority. I didn't show that in the graphs, but there is such questions in terms of trust or authority, and would you like to see in the future more authority? And next slide. There is also polarization of opinion. That's something which also seems noticeable in this world value survey. And there is also certain differences when it comes to people's attitude towards activism, when it comes to political versus social. And it also visible in some other surveys. For example, recent Ebert's Foundation study on the youth, that there is a difference, and it also has certain gender dimension. For example, would you like to be useful for society, or would like to be politically active, and how people form their own sense of citizenship is also would be divided along these two lines. So these are my, I hope, brief, because no one moderated me and look at the time, brief presentation. And now, if there are no further questions, let's move to people who practically work in this area, unlike us who tend to provide an expert opinion. Erkina.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, dear colleagues. I'm very grateful to be presenting on behalf of Smart Zharan Association. As Medet said, but I think this presentation will give more of a practical context to the colleagues that have already presented today. But in general, yes, we can definitely agree and see how conservatism is taking a role in not only relations of citizens to the civic sector itself, and the authorities' relation to the civic sector, which I think is showing up in the legislature and the practices that we are currently seeing every day. So if I please can have the next slide. It's a very interesting situation for civic space practitioners in Kyrgyzstan right now, because it feels like we are stuck between praise and persecution. On one side, international community, different experts praise the civic space in Kyrgyzstan, saying that it's very democratic in comparison to our neighbors, that we have great practices. However, the reality is that freedom of speech and basic human rights that are necessary to exercise civic space are shrinking, and the activists and actors in civic space are being actively prosecuted. So this is a very interesting dynamic that we are operating in. In regards to more concrete examples, we see that the attempts to control information and media are very prevalent in modern day Kyrgyzstan. For example, to give you some practical context, we see that such independent media as Club are currently being forcefully liquidated, and they are going through court procedures. Prominent investigative journalist Volodymyrov has been deported and forcefully stripped of his Kyrgyzstan citizenship for his explosive investigative journalistic pieces, which further provides that while there is some praise to the civic space in Kyrgyzstan, it is a new reality that censorship, and if there is no censorship, persecution is a new reality for the actors. We see that there is increasing intimidation and harassment of journalists, bloggers, civil society activists, lawyers, and others who criticize the authorities and speak out against corruption and any issue that is sensitive to the authorities and those in power. A prominent example of that is the Kimperabad case. I think a lot of you in this room know about it, where over 30 activists, human rights defenders, politicians were detained for meeting to discuss a civic participation method to discuss with the authorities the new realities of border delimitation, which of course puts a lot of censorship within this sector and within the actors, because as more and more human rights activists and lawyers are being detained or prosecuted or pressured, there is much less protection available for the remaining activists. So it's very much a snowfall in sense that the self-censorship is increasing. Of course, in regards to the legal framework, we see that in 2021, a discriminatory law was passed that provides additional financial reporting schemes for NGOs that applies to NGOs only. It's not applied to any businesses, that provides for extensive and exhaustive financial reporting to the tax authorities. On top of that, currently there is a draft law on so-called on foreign agents. If passed, any organization that is considered to be a foreign agent will be subject to such a level of scrutiny and financial reporting that the majority of organizations will be forced to close because they just don't have enough resources to comply with the exhaustive reporting provisions. On top of that, there is authority of the prosecutor's office to attend any trainings, any seminars, any meetings, to sit in your office, to control everything that an organization does. On top of that, there might also be criminal liability for the director and founder of the organization for up to 10 years imprisonment. So of course, that is also providing a huge pressure to the sector, with a lot of organizations considering either complete liquidation or transformation of the approach to become more apolitical, to be more comfortable, to remove yourselves from the public specter, which will have a negative effect on citizens' access and support systems to protect their human rights and to combat injustice. And of course, there's a lot of new practices that I can go on about, but another thing to highlight is a series of court-imposed blanket bans on peaceful protests. So starting from last year spring, there are no peaceful protests allowed on main squares, main streets in Kyrgyzstan, in Bishkek, and now in different regions as well, that effectively restrict any citizens concerned to be heard by the government. It should be noted that in some cases, such peaceful protests are allowed if they are either sanctioned by the government or if they are comfortable for the government. For example, the March for Traditional Values on 8th of March, the Women's Day, was allowed on the main square. However, a march of women's rights activists was pushed back on back streets and back alleys in order to be ignored by the government. So that also shows, as our colleagues have said before, the rise of conservatism and how it's used in dealing with the civil sector. If I can have the next slide, please. So the trends, of course, as I've said, that could go on, the increase in censorship and persecution is definitely something that we have not seen over the past couple of years. The very free use of such criminal code articles as incitement or intention to incite mass riots to overthrow the government is being widely used against all critics who are publicly and permanently discussing sensitive topics or topics that the government deems to be sensitive, which also, of course, leads to transparency-linked restrictions. So we cannot see the state procurement procedures anymore and history. And again, with border eliminations, it has been a very much restricted in terms of public knowledge. The next trend, as the colleagues have said before, is culture and traditions versus human rights. Of course, by the nature of human rights, culture and traditions are not in conflict with human rights. However, the state authorities do seem to make a point of twisting the realities in order to pit these two phenomena against each other. So when activists, civic space actors, human rights defenders talk about human rights, we're often faced with, well, it's against our culture, it's against our traditions. You are Westerners, we are going against our traditions, you just don't respect us, which obviously is not the point. Nobody is fighting culture and traditions. However, the state with their populistic characters, Medet had noted, has put such a stress on this conflict that if you are talking about human rights, you automatically become an enemy of the state, an enemy of the culture, which makes it very hard to build partnerships with state actors, with the constituencies, with citizens, because of course they've seen on TV that you are a bad guy who is against everything they hold dear. Digital restrictions, we see that social media is widely censored. If you are just a regular user online and you happened to say something negative about a figure, you might be brought to questioning, you might be brought for a warning talk, or just in case of permanent a blogger, if you repost something that somebody else has written, you might be facing a jail sentence, which obviously follows that not the space for human rights organizations, for NGOs, for international organizations is very narrowing. And especially if the draft law on so-called foreign agents is passed, the space to effectively fulfill human rights of citizens, to provide assistance, both legal, physical, educational, etc., this ability is essentially restricted. If I can, next slide, please. So from our practitioner side, we did come up with a couple of recommendations for your interest and for discussion. Of course, the first recommendation that we always talk about is that we as a society, as a community, need to urge the authorities to release human rights defenders who are arbitrarily detained in relation for their legitimate human rights work. I think this recommendation goes without question. We also propose that the focus shifts on a couple of priorities. First priority is to empower the civil society, as we are mostly on front lines for sort of building that bridge with the state while it can still be built, and to defend our constituencies. So we are recommending and proposing a new democratic identity that strengthens social cohesion. For example, this could be things like projecting a discourse of democratic religiosity, meaning that promotion of citizenship with democratic religious values. Of course, we would also hope to see that this arbitrary conflict between tradition, culture, religion, and human rights is eliminated. New role, we also suggest that UNESCO as an agency takes up a new role of protection and promotion of freedom of speech. The second priority we recognize to be quite important is cognitive resilience of citizens. So supporting civil society to promote and perform a reform in educational systems, increase of funding for civic educational and research projects that develop the critical thinking of citizens, especially in terms of raising awareness of misinformation and propaganda, because we see that misinformation is a subject that sort of pops up in every single presentation that we've seen today. And we believe that that's a important focus for us all to make, yes. And for the last slide, we suggest that CSO engagement should be expanded to include support of progressive social movements. So, for example, support of innovative tools for civic engagement, community mobilization, gender action learning systems. And of course, adoption of aid approaches that fit to current realities, such as commitment to long-term support, strive toward policy coherence and coordination, flexible funding, long-term core support, and non-financial support. I think non-financial support is definitely something that we are currently in talks with donors about, and something that is needed in order to secure the resilience of the civic space to current challenges. I think that's it for me. So if there are any questions.
Thank you, Erkina. Thanks to all presenters. And I feel to be a good moderator because promised time for discussion we don't have much. But since we started 10 minutes later, if people don't mind, I know the space for lunch should be as sacred as civic space. But any questions or comments, maybe? Yes, please.
Is it right? You can hear me. Just a naive question, really, because you presented a very green picture of civil society and civil society organizations now in the region. From your experience, and this is a question to all wonderful presenters, it was really excellent. Thank you so much. But the question is, did you find in your view that there are some organizations more tolerated by the government and others less tolerated? And can you comment on this organization? What are they doing and why they are still tolerated by the government? Thank you.
Thank you. Erkina, please.
Thank you for your question. Of course, in any populist society, there are organizations that are more tolerated than others. I won't name any names, but there are some organizations that are willing to work on all sides. So they would promote destructive ideas about tradition being a natural enemy of human rights, while also conducting trainings on human rights. So those organizations are very flexible. They don't really have the internal political will to sort of express their political stand openly and clearly. And of course, those organizations who are very much in the wrong in the eyes of the government are those who are expressing their political views clearly, especially now, as I've mentioned, with the detainment of human rights activists. Those who come openly in their protection, those are put on a not liked list, if I can call it that. So definitely it's a question of adjustability. It's a question of their willingness to sort of openly express their political opinions. But on top of that, such organization as organization working for example, disadvantaged youth or migrants or people with disabilities, those organizations don't really come into aggression from the state because they're doing something that the state cannot physically, economically do. So, of course, on top of there being quite comfortable organizations, they're also needed organizations that the state recognizes they can do for themselves. So it's a different question of roles. If you're talking about political rights organizations, then yeah, it's just a question of their open position, really.
Thank you. Yes, please.
Thank you so much for all your presentations, but I was wondering about I mean, I think Aizharkyn mentioned in her research that was mostly NGO experts and representatives who were surveyed during the research. And I also feel like in a lot of research and like lately surveys, it's mostly people who work either in the NGO sector or mostly loyal to NGO sector are being surveyed and asked. But I don't know if you have encountered any other surveys among people who we call opponents of a civil society. I wonder if there were any kind of research done on the opinion perception of conservative so-called groups, on their perception of what civil society is. Because I think there is a common understanding that activism per se, it's a positive thing among Kyrgyz society, because we see that there are a lot of volunteers who mobilize in case of like COVID-19 and stuff. But I just want to see whether there is actually I don't know, any evidence gathered or collected based on their opinions, and if you know any. Thank you.
Aizharkyn, please.
Yeah, thank you very much for the question. I can mention here one of the groups which I didn't include to this presentation, but in other research conducted 1.5 years ago, it was with a group of so-called traditionalists, yeah, those who are promoting these conservative, as we say, values. And it was quite interesting to see that their perception of civil society is quite different from what we mean by that. Yeah, and the main problem is that group of people consider civil society organizations as, first of all, only NGOs. And then they believe that this is a very narrow understanding of civil society, because those organizations, in their understanding, are just speaking about human rights, democracy, liberal values, and so on. But they do not understand, in their opinion, they do not understand the cultural context and the way how, as they say, real society is organized and real society operates. And when I try to clarify what they mean by civil society, it was very interesting to see that, in their opinion, a lot of community-based organizations, they also consider civil society, but the problem is that they do not call them civil society. They say this is real community organizations, those who are truly needed, but they have nothing in common or nothing to do with civil society organizations. So I think in this case, we have a clear problem of misunderstanding and misinterpretation and a very narrow perception of what civil society is. And probably here, instead of trying to find out more differences and discrepancies between our understanding, yeah, I mean, those who belong to these civil society institutions in our, let's say, again, Western understanding, yeah, and those who are working on the grassroots level, that we need probably to diversify the ways how we speak about civil society, and make it more and more integrative, because otherwise this gap between our understanding and this misinterpretation will just deteriorate the situation, yeah. And then what was also interesting that in terms of this so-called traditionalism, when they speak about society and such things as, for example, mutual support, collaboration, common platforms, yeah, and so on and so forth, the problem is that they actually speak about the same things, but using different concepts. And this is also the problem of language. It's not just about Russian or Kyrgyz, yeah? It's not about English or Kyrgyz, yeah? It's more about the cultural concepts, which we may call cultural codes, which we probably haven't tackled yet. And this is very critical for us, because we need to find out these entry points in order to speak about things which are really touching to people. Otherwise, we will keep very detached from the cultural context, which we are trying actually to make better to all of us. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Aizharkyn. And I think we can accommodate just one more quick, if there are any questions or comments. Yes.
I was curious about your recommendation to support Kyrgyz Zharan. and how that relates to the government's policy on Kyrgyz-Tirani. Is there any kind of synergy there?
Short answer.
Yes, thank you. Well, maybe on paper there is, but in practice probably won't be. I believe the government's Kyrgyz-Tirana policies is more oriented on traditionalism, traditional cultures, etc., while we are proposing that the conception of a Kyrgyz citizen is that of media literates, independent in their opinion forming, etc. Actually, we are going to be organizing a forum next year on what citizen does Kyrgyzstan need. So I think that's something that we are beginning our work on. We're definitely going to be forming that concept in regards to what is needed, what we believe is needed, what the other parties believe is needed. But it's a difficult question. I think that the government's policies is definitely mostly oriented on self-preservation and promotion of traditionalism, while we are mostly trying to get away with from that, while also supporting such movements as decolonization, culture, progression, etc.
Yes, thank you. And on that note, thanks a lot to speakers. Thanks a lot for your questions and comments and for your patience and attendance. Thanks.